I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Roger Koppel, today's speaker, who will be speaking to you on forensic science and criminal law. And I'll begin with what is perhaps a not terribly funny but often repeated joke about economics. It was told to me by an economist. It's pretty common for lawyers to tell self-loathing, self-mocking jokes about law, but I was a little bit surprised to get such a case of self-abnegation from an economist, but nevertheless, here it is. So for professors, I suppose I'm obligated to call them FDU professors, or on their way to an idyllic spot, we'll call it the Vancouver campus, and they get lost along the way. There's a great storm. They find themselves stuck on a desert island. I'm not sure what that would be between here and Vancouver, but work with me, use your imagination. Sadly, tragically, they only have one giant can of baked beans. Could be a very unpleasant time before they're rescued. And no can opener. So, of course, each of them offers their distinctive academic perspective on the solution. The physicist in the group proposes that they climb a tree and drop the can of beans, at which point it will splatter open, the acceleration of gravity and all that stuff. I was obviously not a physics major. And the group decides that's not a great option because it would be quite messy, the beans would be splattered across the sands, et cetera, et cetera. The chemist proposes that they soak the can in the salt brine of the seawater, and eventually the chemical properties of the salt will corrode through the can, and they'll be able to enjoy, I guess now, a seawater bean stew, which sounds mighty delicious to me too. The political scientist, as a political scientist, I'm obligated to add this. The political scientist proposes that they organize a small administrative state and appoint a minister of beans to open the can. That also seems a little unwieldy. The economist, and here is the supposed joke, the economist says, never mind all that, assume the can opener. So the joke, and many of you are thinking, what's the joke here? The joke is supposed to be that there's a tradition of economic analysis, and I think by extension it can be academic analysis, that is abstract, impractical, requires many fanciful and unrealistic assumptions about human nature, rationality, the kinds of decisions that guide people in the marketplace. Well, fortunately, there is certainly a different tradition of economics, of economic thinking, that goes in a very different direction, that assumes economics has a lot to teach us about human incentives, about how humans navigate in the social world, navigate around organizations, that assumes economics and economic perspectives can teach us a great deal in sometimes unexpected ways about human behavior and the hidden realities of our policies and social and political lives. This tradition is captured by such books as Freakonomics, which is a big bestseller and a very successful economically oriented book, but it's also captured by stories in the news every day. There was a story on NPR just last week about how the proliferation of medical marijuana clinics has led to an increase in the price of pot. And I'm throwing this out there, that might be of some interest to our undergraduate body. The basic idea was that this, perhaps counterintuitively, was increasing demand as people got a sense that there was an imprimatur of legality on this previously contraband product, and now, therefore, it was more available for general use, and that was increasing demand and therefore price. That kind of analysis is one that economics can distinctively provide. It's also the kind of analysis that we are fortunate to have today in the figure of Roger Koppel, who is going to talk today about the intersection of economic thought and economic modes of thinking to the problem of forensic science, and problems that presumably many of us have not even thought of before today, but that we will surely think of more deeply and in a more troubled way after today's session. Dr. Koppel is a professor of economics and finance in the Silverman College of Business at FDU, and he is the director of Silverman's Institute for Forensic Science Administration. He'll tell you more in today's talk about what forensic science is, but in a nutshell, it is a study of how error rates in forensic science may affect institutional and organizational structures, including those that send people to prison. His experiments have been funded by the National Science Foundation and the Earhart Foundation, and he is a blogger on Think Markets. So if you like today's conversation, you can check out that blog and follow his latest musings. He is widely published. He is the author of several books, including Big Players in the Economic Theory of Expectations, and over 80 academic articles and book chapters on a variety of topics, including many of those that relate to today's conversation. So if you want more reading, more information, you can certainly get it. I'm happy to point you in that direction. But for right now, please join me in welcoming Professor Roger Koppel.
I had a little trip to California planned, but now I'm just not as enthused about that. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Bruce. Your department, the Department of Social Sciences, has always been a strong supporter of economics education on the campus, and I've noticed that and appreciated it quite a bit. Okay, that's not how it works. There we go. Can we all hear me? Way in the back, lift your hand if you can hear me okay. Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes. Wonderful, thank you. All right, that's not how it works on TV. That was this morning's inspiration. There we go. We're talking today about forensic science errors. Now, this is a big problem. You might not think it's a big problem. Turns out it is a big problem. We can't measure errors the same way you can measure, the circumference of the Earth or something, because they're errors, so they're hidden. But probably forensic science is contributing to over 20,000 false felony convictions per year in the United States. The great legal theorist Michael Reisinger has estimated a 3.3% rate of minimum factual rate of false conviction for rape murders in the 1980s. Okay. So if that 3.3 number is a good one for felonies in general, then with over 1 million felony convictions per year in the United States, we're talking about over 33,000 false felony convictions per year in the United States. Michael Sachs and Jay Kohler had a famous article in Science in 2005 indicating that about 2/3 of false convictions in a group that they studied were attributable to forensic science testing errors or false or misleading forensic science testimony, or of course some combination thereof. So we're probably looking at, so if you do the 2/3 times the 33,000, you come up with something like 20 or 22,000. So we're looking probably at more than 22,000 false felony convictions per year because of, in some sense, faulty forensics. So I think it's a serious problem. Okay. Oh yes, here we go. You can see pictures here of Josiah Sutton and George Rodriguez. And this illustrates actually the two sides of the problem. Josiah Sutton on your left was sent to the big house when he was a boy of 16, charged with and convicted of rape on the basis almost exclusively of DNA evidence that was later shown to be completely false and erroneous. Okay. A properly conducted DNA test fully exonerated Sutton and showed that he could not have been one of the perpetrators of this rather heinous crime. And he was in the jail he was in prison for 4.5 years. So from 16 to 21, he was in jail because of a forensic science testing error in DNA. On the right, you see George Rodriguez, who was also convicted of rape. George Rodriguez, forensic evidence in the case of George Rodriguez was traditional serology, traditional serological testing. What's your blood type? A, B, O. And the test was conducted in a perfectly satisfactory manner. Okay? But the forensic scientist, Mr. Bolding, interpreting the evidence in court, interpreted the evidence to not exclude Rodriguez, whereas the evidence did exclude Rodriguez. So here it was a false or misleading interpretation of the evidence that put Mr. Rodriguez in the big house. Okay? So there's human faces behind this phenomenon. In both of these cases happen to come from the celebrated and infamous case of the Houston Crime Lab. At the period of Sutton's conviction, I don't know about Rodriguez's, period of Sutton's conviction, this photograph represents the state of the Houston Crime Lab. You see that there's a hole in the ceiling. And if you look on the right of the screen, the left of the screen, you can see a workbench that's just about under the hole in the ceiling. So it's raining, and the rain is getting on the evidence and polluting the evidence, and they're just running their tests. Welcome to CSI. Another famous failure of forensic science in the United States is the case of Brandon Mayfield. The FBI made a 100% match. That's the quote from the FBI, a 100% match of Brandon Mayfield to a latent print retrieved from the crime scene of the 2004 Madrid train bombing. That's sort of their 9/11. So it's quite an important crime, a very terrible crime, a terroristic crime. Okay. And they picked up this latent, they sent it around on Interpol, they being the Spanish authorities, and the FBI said, we've got your guy. Trouble was that they didn't. Okay. And in fact, they later apologized and settled for, I think, $1 or $2 million with Mayfield, who naturally sued. Now, the Department of Justice, the National Institute of Justice, Office of the Inspector General, was commissioned to do a study. What happened? What happened? Let's investigate this. How could such a terrible thing happen? And you read the text here. We determined that the FBI examiners were not aware of Mayfield's religion, which was Islam. He was a convert to Islam. At the time of they concluded Mayfield was the source of latent fingerprint 17. The records available to the examiners do not reveal his religion, his marriage to an Egyptian immigrant, or his representation of other Muslims as an attorney. The OIG found no evidence that the FBI laboratory had knowledge of Mayfield's religion until the FBI Portland Division learned this fact in the early stages of the field investigation after the identification of Mayfield had been verified by the FBI laboratory. Sure. This is a very celebrated case. That didn't get enough laughs. This is the report of the OIG. Okay. Many of us, myself included, view this as not a credible report, as implausible. We suspect that the diligence of the OIG notwithstanding, it is likely that the fingerprint examiners who made that 100% identification of Mayfield as the source of latent fingerprint 17 did so in the full knowledge of his apparent ties with radical Islamists. All right, now many of you, who knows the name Cameron Todd Willingham, perhaps because of a famous September 7th, 2009 New Yorker article on his false execution in the state of Texas? Okay. A few people, okay. So he's kind of the new poster boy for flawed forensics. He was executed in 2004 for the arson murder of his own 3 children. This evidence, his conviction was based principally upon now discredited techniques of fire investigation, techniques that were discredited as of 1992. Okay. And he was convicted in 1991, but not executed until 2004. So in 12 years, they weren't able to correct the error. Okay. This has become quite a cause célèbre. There is Willingham with his family and his 3 now tragically expired young children. I want to say a word about this. I've been using the Willingham case in my writings quite a bit. After this New Yorker article, I kind of feel the need to stick a little bit of a footnote onto it, because you hear this mantra from those who, like myself, seek reform of forensic science, and especially those who oppose the death penalty. They say often that Willingham was, quote, almost certainly innocent. Well, now, wait a minute. Reasonable doubt of Willingham's guilt is not innocence beyond a reasonable doubt. So I feel this notion that he's almost certainly innocent to be at least possibly overstated. I do believe a preponderance of the evidence points to his innocence, but that seems to me beyond a more mild statement than the one we see repeated in the New Republic by representatives of the ACLU and quite a few others. On the other hand, a crime lab report, somewhat of a sort of unofficial official voice of forensic science, that is, a self-appointed spokesman for forensic science orthodoxy in the United States, has the following rather shocking statement about the Willingham case. It is a mistake, however, to prematurely assume that the investigators, meaning the fire investigators, conclusions were based entirely on physical evidence. I thought that's what forensic scientists were supposed to examine, was the physical evidence. So this is a really shocking confusion of investigative and scientific opinions. Okay. So a pox on both houses. Okay, so how is this possible? Okay, perhaps I've convinced you that it's at least maybe possible that forensic science in the United States, and I think really throughout the world, is in rather poor shape. It's not as, in quotation marks, scientific as we might have thought. Well, I put the word scientific, by the way, in quotation marks for the sake of any of my colleagues out there intimate with recent results in the philosophy of science. Okay. You got to be careful because you want to be able to have lunch with them later in the lunchroom and not be, shunned. Well, there's three things, I think, that explain how it's possible for forensic scientists to be in such a miserable state that likely we're putting at least 20,000 people away on false felony convictions per year, in part because of forensic science testing errors or false or misleading forensic science testimony. First, forensic science turns out to be a highly subjective discipline, unexpectedly. Secondly, crime labs are part of law enforcement agencies. And I put law enforcement in quotation marks because in preparing this slide exactly, it occurred to me that this language that we're all used to of law enforcement, meaning the FBI, the local police department, local sheriff's department, and the prosecutor's office, is somewhat inappropriate because we have an entire criminal justice system that includes public defenders who are have an essential role to play in making sure we get the bad guys in jail and not the good guys. Okay? And yet we only call a fraction of the folks in the system law enforcement. Okay? Struck me as an inappropriate linguistic choice. Continuing, the third key is, and this gets to sort of my contribution to the diagnosis of the problem, crime labs have, in a sense I'll explain in a few slides, a twofold monopoly. And I learned in business school monopoly is bad. Forensic science is subjective. A very important report was released almost exactly a year ago today, a year and about a week ago today, I guess, by the National Academy of Sciences. And it included the following statement among many zingers. In a number of forensic science disciplines, forensic science professionals have yet to establish either the validity of their approach or the accuracy of the conclusions, and the courts, have been utterly ineffective in addressing this problem. We think of, for example, fingerprint evidence as being highly reliable, notwithstanding the Mayfield misident, as it's called in the trade. But I ask you this question: how many validation studies do you imagine have been performed on latent fingerprint analysis as it is conducted in the United States today? Well, if I'm asking a question, you suspect the answer is low. It is low. The answer is 0. 0 validation tests have been performed. So there's simply a deficiency, a profound deficiency of clear, tested, validated scientific foundations for the techniques being used in really all forensic science disciplines, with the partial exception of DNA, to which I'll return presently. So you get kind of the idea about this if you look at these two prints. On the left, we see an impression of a rolled impression of the left index finger of Brandon Mayfield. And on the right, you see the latent print 17 lifted from the crime scene of the Madrid train bombing. Now, if I had two images with the clarity and distinctness of that left image, I can unambiguously decide whether or not the pattern is the same, and it seems clear that our fingerprint patterns, the patterns of our so-called friction ridge on our fingertips, the palms of our hands, and on the bottoms of our feet, are indeed unique and to each individual and enduring. So therefore, on your laptop, you can have a little, who's got a little fingerprint detecting technology on his laptop? Fewer than I expected, but several people. That's pretty reliable because you make a nice, clear, and distinct image. Those pesky criminals have the bad habit of not leaving clear, rolled prints on the crime scene, but leaving instead smudged, incomplete, and prints that are sometimes overlain one on top of the other. It's not so clear that we can reliably associate a latent and a rolled print, at least when the latent print is ambiguous, as it is in the right image on the screen here. Okay, so some courts, some jurists are beginning to get the sense of this, referring to the so-called ACE-V method of fingerprint, or sometimes ACE-V methodology of fingerprint examination practice today in the United States. Judge Susan Souter in the capital case Maryland versus Brian Rose ruled fingerprint evidence as such out of her court for capital cases. Said, look, if there's a capital case and you bring the fingerprint evidence simply isn't reliable enough to bring to bear on the defendant. In fact, it is, and I'll just read only the highlighted bit there, a subjective, untested, unverifiable identification procedure that purports to be infallible. The FBI, I think it was Agent Yeager, but anyway, the FBI went into Susan Souter's court, and in 2007, after the Mayfield misident, and after quite a bit of good academic work by Simon Cole exposing and chronicling many other known fingerprint errors, went into Susan Souter's court and said the error rate of fingerprint examination of fingerprint analysis under the ACE-V methodology is 0. Any science students in the room? If you told your professor that you had a technique of analysis that had a 0 error rate, okay, your professor's not going to be happy. Even DNA has a very high degree of, let me say that again, even DNA is highly subjective. Okay? We think of it as extremely objective and in this sense, in quotes, scientific. Instead, it's actually, as practiced, often, not universally, but often quite subjective. It's much less scientific than we had thought. And indeed, in some of the essential elements of the technique as now practiced lack scientific foundations, allowing therefore for bias and error to enter. Let me give you a little clue how that could possibly be true. Modern criminal forensic DNA analysis uses electropherograms. So you gather the DNA sample either directly from a suspect or from a crime scene or whatnot. You mix it with certain reagents, you run it through a genetic analyzer. The genetic analyzer, in a highly literal sense, takes a picture of the prepared fluid, the DNA sample mixed with the reagents as it goes through a thin capillary tube. But then all that data is represented as a squiggly line to the DNA examiner. Okay. So you see that top row, oops, I apologize. There we go. That top row is a little bit of an electropherogram, about a fourth of an electropherogram derived from a suspect. Okay. And you see, what, 4 clear and distinct electropherograms of alternative, as it were, competing suspects. And if you look for a while, you can see that suspect 3 is a clear match. Suspects 1, 2, and 4 are clearly excluded as contributors to the blood stain on the top of the chart. I realized I didn't say what I meant to. The very top line is the crime scene DNA. That's what I meant to say. I apologize about that. That's from the blood stain. There was plenty of blood. It wasn't corrupted. It wasn't mixed with other people's DNA. So they got a nice clean electropherogram out. So then the suspect's clean electropherograms derived from so-called buccal swabs, where you take a Q-tip and rub it in somebody's mouth a little bit, can be unambiguously associated or dissociated from, in this case, the blood stain. Suspect 3 is our guy. Well, yeah, okay, that's fine, but what if the sample of DNA gathered from the crime scene looks rather more like what is here labeled as saliva sample? Okay. So the question is, is that leftward, that most leftward thing a peak or an artifact? Is that blob hiding a peak or not? Okay, that's a subjective judgment. I won't elaborate, but it's a subjective judgment. One whose resolution in the mind of the DNA examiner will typically be influenced, or at least often, and I think typically, I think indeed universally, be influenced by the co-presence when examining that electropharogram of the criminal defendant in the case. They look at them at the same time. So if the defendant had a peak at 12, it is likely that or certainly possible that the DNA examiner would say, you know, that's not an artifact at 12 on the first locus there, but rather a peak. And there's some informal empirical evidence gathered by the great William C. Thompson supporting that statement. And similarly for a blob. Not only does the DNA examiner, indeed the forensic scientist in any of the disciplines, have the sample from the suspect or information about the suspect, we also get information like this that can create bias. Here's some DNA lab notes from the Virginia case of Commonwealth v. Davis. I asked how they got their suspect. He is a convicted rapist and the MO matches the former rape. The suspect was recently released from prison and works in the same building as the victim. She was afraid of him. Also, his demeanor was suspicious when they brought him in for questioning. He also fits the general description of the man witnesses saw leaving the area on the night they think she died. We don't have information about how precise those descriptions are. Okay? But I would not personally be surprised if they're really quite vague descriptions. Continuing, so I said, I being the DNA examiner, so I said, you basically have nothing to connect him directly with the murder unless we find his DNA. He said yes. Should the victim's fear of the suspect be in the scientific lab notes of the DNA technician? I feel there's scope here for inappropriate biasing of what is possibly in the end a very subjective analysis. Here's just a couple of more bits from unidentified cases. Again, these are the lab notes. A suspect, known gang member, keeps skating on charges, never serves time. This robbery, he gets hit in the head with bar stool, left blood trail. Miller, the deputy DA in the case, wants to connect guy to scene with DNA. So the lab technician, the DNA technician who wrote those notes, he knows what his job is. He's working for Miller, and his job is to link the crime scene evidence with the suspect, who he knows for a fact, or thinks he knows for a fact, to be a really bad guy. Okay? Another case, death penalty case, exclamation point, needs to eliminate item number 57, and then we see the name of the individual as possible suspect. Again, the technician enters the test knowing what the correct answer is, what result he's supposed to get. All right, I could elaborate on that and would like to, but time is scarce. So I think it's fair to conclude that forensic science is highly subjective. Why is that a problem? Well, because then the analysis is unreliable and possibly biased. Solutions for this problem include more research on the scientific foundations of forensic science, somehow figuring out how to prevent overclaiming, where you make the evidence seem to say more than it really says, where you mortify ambiguity in the evidence. Okay? It's a huge problem identified by, again, the great Simon Cole and others. And finally, so-called sequential unmasking, which is masking or blinding, whereby we prevent the forensic scientist from having any case-specific information that might inappropriately bias his or her analysis of the evidence, at least until after the potentially biased decisions have been made. Hence the term sequential in the phrase sequential unmasking. That last is really quite important. All right, so that was the first of our three explanations for how it could be true that forensic science is not what we might have otherwise thought it to be. The second one is that crime labs are a part of law enforcement, and I'm going to have to hurry up here. So I'll just move along somewhat quickly. You can see the same important government report indicates in the quote that I'm not going to read that most crime labs are organized under police or prosecutors, mostly under police agencies, and that this creates the risk of bias. Okay? So the problem is conscious and unconscious bias. The solution is independence. Independence is not so easily achieved. We need not only formal, but substantive independence of the crime lab from so-called law enforcement. All right, and here's my contribution to the analysis of the problem, monopoly. We have, in a sense, a twofold monopoly in forensic science in the United States today, and indeed, typically in the world. First, evidence, once it is sent to one lab, is unlikely to be examined by any other lab, and so we have a monopoly in examinations. Correlated with that is the monopoly in interpretation, whereby tests and interpretation are given by one and the same lab. Okay. If you recall the case of George Rodriguez, you begin to see why it's important to separate test and interpretation. Okay. The test in that case was fine, the interpretation was scientifically groundless and just a straight error. All right, so the monopoly in forensic examinations is a problem because errors may go undetected. Indeed, fraud may go undetected. We don't know whether there's just a little bit of fraud or more than a little bit of fraud in forensic science, but any is undesirable, and fraud may go and has gone undetected in forensic science. Cases we know of where fraud has been revealed, we find that it's gone on sometimes quite a long time before finally being exposed. So the solution that I propose, this is my contribution to the sort of cure for the problem, the solution I propose is random, independent, multiple examinations. In other words, the old scientific idea of replication. Sometimes, at least, we ought to send the evidence to, say, 3 crime labs instead of 1. If they come back with distinct answers, we better find out why. And in so doing, we'll have some measure of how reliable these analyses are, and indeed how reliable the analyses of a given lab might be. All right, so why would that solution work? Well, look, if each examiner has, let's say, now I'm just making up numbers in order to have some easy arithmetic. If each examiner has, say, a 5% chance of making an error, I'm not even going to distinguish OU scientists here between type 1 and type 2 errors. If each examiner has a 5% chance of error, the chance of a majority of 3 all committing the same error, a majority of 3, 2 or 3 out of the 3 committing the same error, it turns out to be less than 1%. It's 0.75%. So that's quite a significant reduction in error probability. Okay? So just that simple, arithmetic of probabilities tells you why replication is a good idea in forensic science as it is in research science. And the metaphor I like to use here is that distinguishing a chain from a net. A chain is only strong as its weakest link. A net may be stronger than any of its knots. All right, now in interpretation, we also have a monopoly. So the problem is that false interpretations may go unchallenged, and that even when there's no demonstrably false interpretation at work, alternate hypotheses may go unexamined. The solution is defense right, to have a substantive defense right to forensic science expertise, okay, which gives you then something else you've got in research science, rival explanations. So we need, in my view, a kind of forensic science and an expertise analogy to our Gideon right to legal counsel, which quite makes sense if you consider that in many cases, indeed, in many cases in which forensic science is present, the scientist is the most important figure in determining what the outcome of the case is, not jurists. Why the solution works? Well, experts on each side will tend to look at the issue from that side, therefore catching errors the other side might miss. Okay? So we're letting one bias be a check against another, which is the same root notion of checks and balances behind the United States Constitution. All right, we're getting close to the end now. I have, another 5 minutes to speak, is that right? Okay. Error reduction is cost saving for the criminal justice system. This is a surprise. I did a study to figure out how expensive my suggestion of redundancy might be to get some bead on the price. And it turns out actually it's not merely inexpensive. It turns out that redundancy is going to lower the cost of administering the criminal justice system, because it turns out that forensic science errors are expensive. It costs a lot of money to keep a felony convict in prison for the average sentence, for the period of corresponding to the average sentence. by comparison to which forensic science tests are cheap. Okay? So forensic science is a bargain for the criminal justice system, and we need more of it. So in research science, while it's all about replication and rival interpretations, we have in research science structural redundancy. The results of any one lab may be challenged by any other. Okay? Those of you who happen to know the story of cold fusion may think of that as a very good example of the salutary role of redundancy in keeping error out of research science. Essential to this process, a necessary part of the process, is of course rival interpretations of such data as we have, embodied in the correct and proper cliche that it takes a theory to beat a theory. Okay? So research science and forensic science, random independent multiple forensic examinations create a structural redundancy for forensic science, just as we have in research science. A defense right to forensic science expertise creates rival interpretations. I've come to the opinion that that's the linchpin reform there. That because without that, the other reforms aren't really going to stick and continue over time to do their good work. So I've become quite fixed on bullet point number 2. Together, these two anti-monopoly measures will make the organization of forensic science more perfectly resemble that of research science. For more, please visit my institute website, www.fdu.edu/IFSA, Institute for Forensic Science Administration. Thank you.
Okay, we will now open things up to questions. I certainly have some questions of my own, but let me hear from somebody else first. Hold on a second. Any students want to bravely jump in? Go ahead, Jeff.
What possible connection does the religion of the fingerprinters or of the apprehended ones have in the first case that you illustrated?
Well, because we're talking about the Madrid train bombing. This was an act of terrorism perpetrated, we believe, by Islamic terrorists, radical Islamists. Okay? So it is likely, or seems so or might seem so to investigators, that the persons perpetrating this act were themselves radical Islamists. Okay? So you're unlikely to be, have any other religion than Islam if you're involved in the crime. So the suspicion that many of us have is that the knowledge of Mayfield's conversion to Islam, together with the fact that he was worshiping in a mosque where radical Islamists worshipped, and defended one of them even in a civil action in a court of law, our suspicion is that these facts made him look guilty to the fingerprint examiners. This is, just in plain terms, the examiners probably thought, oh, this is the work of Islamists. This guy's an Islamist. Oh, and look, there's a similarity between his fingerprint and the latent. We got our guy.
Got our next question over here.
You differed slightly from your colleagues, and I guess it was even a bit more radical. And with the separation or independence of the forensic labs, you suggested maybe a privatization of them. Would you like to elaborate on this?
Yeah, he's asking me about privatization. He's been on my website. So I do advocate sort of a suite of reforms, and the sort of last main element to my suite of reforms is privatization of crime labs. I do think that would make things better. It exposes the crime lab to a real and meaningful civil liability, and it turns out, ironically, to make regulation of the crime lab easier, a particular regulation by the federal government. The federal government, because of our system of federalism, cannot regulate the processes and procedures in a state or lower level crime lab, a state crime lab or crime lab organized under a county or municipal government. It's not possible within our political system. So for these reasons, I think we ought to have privatization. I also think privatization would help us to find out what in econ lingo are the economies of scale and scope. How big should a crime lab be? Should one crime lab do both traditional serology and DNA and fingerprints, or only two of those three, or what? How should it all be organized? Well, the profit motive and the experience of profit and loss in a market system helps us to figure those things out. So I'm completely in favor of all that. The reason I squirm when I get prompted with this question is that I sincerely believe this to be the least important of the reforms I propose in my suite of reforms, and I believe that privatization is likely to be harmful if it is not accompanied by all those other things that I suggest. So if we just, give you a monopoly and make it a private monopoly, that's not improving the situation. Okay? And for an example, I consider the Michael Nifong and the so-called Duke case, in which he and the private lab that he commissioned to do the DNA work in that case conspired together to withhold evidence, exculpatory evidence in the Duke rape case. Okay. Is that an answer to your question?
Another question over here.
What is your take on governmental oversight on forensic evidence?
I favor oversight, but I think it's a weak read. And what I'm going to try to persuade the audience of in Seattle in a week or two is that we have with oversight the great risk of regulatory capture. So many persons, for example, today suspect, rightly in my opinion, that the FDA, Federal Drug Administration, is rather more inclined to serve the interests of large pharmaceutical enterprises than to be a controlling factor protecting the citizens against possible error or abuse by the large pharmaceutical enterprises. So there's just one example of the risk that a regulatory agency may be captured by the concentrated interests whom it is purportedly supposed to control. So, I think it would be better to have, for a reason I'll give in a second, I think it would be better to have federal oversight of forensic science than not to have federal oversight of forensic science. But I still think it's a weak read. It's got this problem of capture. We need other reforms. We need real checks and balances. Oversight is not checks and balances, it's command and control. Why do I think, nevertheless, it would be an improvement to have federal oversight? Well, because right now we have what this government report I've cited a couple of times, issued by the National Academy of Sciences, calls fragmentation. So you have a municipal crime lab, you have a county crime lab, you have a state crime, there's no system at all. So the liberty to act within these small unsupervised units is high, and therefore the scope for honest error and willful abuse or neglect and negligence of duty are all relatively high. They would be reduced, I think, perhaps marginally, but anyway reduced by federal oversight.
Forgive me if you've already covered this, but you've said that testing is expensive. And in, I believe, Alaska, the victims were required to pay for their rape testing. What is the standard procedure? Are victims required to pay for forensic testing?
I don't think I said forensic science testing is expensive. In fact, what I said was that forensic science tests are cheap compared to the cost of forensic science error. Okay? On account of which redundant testing would actually be cost-saving for the criminal justice system. Now, I have not conducted a similar study to the one I did about fingerprints for the hypothesis of testing for defense experts. Right? This idea I have, that following Paul Gianelli and others of a substantive defense right for the to expertise. If we had that system, is it really true? Could I show with the numbers that would be cheaper than the current system for administering, the whole criminal justice? I think it would be. I think it would save costs. But I haven't done a study to show that that's true. Well, the way we have no system. There is no system. So in a sense, I can't give you an answer. I can tell you the substantive position of many suspects in the criminal justice system, which is that they have no substantive access to forensic science expertise. The Alaska case you're referring to, it's about, if I've not misunderstood, it's about an incarcerated convict's right to get DNA testing on evidence that might exist in his case file. Okay. Then I don't know the facts that you're referring to.
That the victims could not have the right to testing unless they were willing to pay for the
The
test.
victim.
The victim, the rape victim was
Oh.
required to pay for the test.
Oh, okay. This is an interesting fact. I didn't, you know, I thought you were referring to one thing. I didn't absorb what you said. I'm so glad we got that straightened out. I don't know what the law is in other states. There is no system. I could answer a different question about the suspects, but I have no wisdom on the victims. I'm not aware of, and I suspect I would be aware of, the existence of any jurisdiction in which victims are regularly at liberty to arrange their own testing at state expense. I view it as improbable that such a system exists in any jurisdiction within the United States, but I have no specific facts.
Yes, you make a very plausible case for change in the system. Anyone who's been involved in quality processes and the outcomes that occur when you don't have a quality process, there's no quality control. So you've made a good case. What has to happen? Does it have to have a federal action? Does it have to have legislation? Can a state, an individual state, take an action to proceed? You've got a national association. You're obviously going to try to convince them to get behind you. What are you going to do?
I think that the predominant view today among persons who recognize a problem with forensic science in the United States and desire effective action to improve forensic science in the United States is that, the predominant view among such folks is that we need oversight. Bring in the federal government to sweep in on its white horse and get these crime labs to run right. As I said in response to an earlier question, I think that's an ineffective technique. I think the real, I have this suite of reforms. I've outlined how do you really get the political system to adopt that suite of reforms. It's a fight, and it's a tough fight because there's no concentrated money interest behind the kind of reforms that I think ought to happen. So in some sense, the answer then to your question is, I don't know, I'm in there slugging, trying to do what I can. Now, what I also said in response, toward the end of my talk, I still believe, and I believe quite strongly, the really key, the linchpin reform is getting a substantive defense right to expertise. That's really the key. What may happen if we don't have such a right is that we put in this, that, or the other reform. We have redundancy, or we have a National Institute of Forensic Science, or we have whatever it is. And perhaps for an initial period, it'll work. We'll have fewer forensic science errors. But the persons whose actions are influenced by such reforms will, over time, learn how to compensate for them. And so without continued and renewed external pressure for such compensating behaviors to be themselves compensated for, in turn, the effectiveness of the reform will fade over time. And that's absolutely what's going to happen. If we get this, that, or the other reform, it may work for a little bit to improve things, and then it'll just fade into nothingness and zero. You got to have rivalry. You have to have advocacy built into the system. So when you have the forensic scientist, forensic science expert for the prosecution and the forensic science expert for the defense looking at the same forensic science evidence, it will again and again and again be true that for one party or the other, it is in that party's interest to identify infirmities in the forensic science system which cast doubt on the veracity of the evidence being brought in court. Okay? And that builds in a constant pressure for upstream improvement in the system. That makes it possible that any reforms we put in will stick. Okay? Without that, the system is Teflon. No reform will stick.
We're going to take one more question.
You've suggested that there be independent analysis of forensic science data. So, for example, you said you could have 3 experts look at the forensic science data, and if it was 2 to 1, you cut down the probability of error to less than 1%, which makes sense. On the other hand, it seems closer. On the other hand, it seems to me it's incredibly impractical, in spite of the fact that you point out that convicting somebody incorrectly cost the system $100,000 a year to incarcerate them. The fact is, there was a show on, I believe it was Frontline, a year or more ago, talking about rape kits. I believe they're in California. Are you familiar with that particular show? At any rate, they pointed out that there are multiple thousands of backlog, more than 10 years of backlog of unanalyzed rape kits because they haven't got sufficient personnel and sufficient funds to analyze them. If rape kits are anything like the rest of the DNA evidence that we're talking about, where are you going to get the multiplication of laboratories times 3, 4, 5, which are certified laboratories? You can have laboratories, you're talking about being sure that they are qualified laboratories. I'm sure you can have them be boarded by their national organization, showing that they have got qualifications. But where are you going to get all these things right now, today, on February 16th, 2010? You're talking about 20, 30, 40 years from now under ideal circumstances.
Well, I'll take what I can get. I'm in it for the long haul. It's a kind of illusion that I try my best to fight, but it's a natural sort of illusion to think that I'm proposing that we're going to have now 3 crime labs everywhere we have 1. Okay? That's not my suggestion. Now we may characterize the system as having 1 crime lab per jurisdiction. Now, careful, we have no system, so it's much more complicated than that. But that's a sort of the least wrong brief characterization. One lab per jurisdiction. Okay? I would like to see maybe, I don't know, say 6 labs per jurisdiction. Okay? But I would also like to see each lab serving, say, 6 jurisdictions. Okay? So the capital requirements of redundancy are infinitely lower than they sound at first to be. They're not 0 because if we're going to do even random redundant testing, we're going to be, doing more testing, and therefore we have higher capital requirements. But they're extremely modest. They're infinitely lower than what it sounds like when you first hear 3 tests. Okay. Also, I think we have to appreciate that we can get redundancy a lot of different ways. So consider the DNA typing that we discussed earlier. There's a kind of total redundancy you might imagine, whereby the original crime scene sample is divided into 3 parts and given to 3 labs. But it's still a form of redundancy, and a much cheaper form of redundancy, to simply distribute the completed electropherograms to multiple examiners, multiple independent examiners. Okay? So that's maybe not as much redundancy as you'd like, but it's still a kind of a system of checks and balances. So I'll take what I can get. I'm in it for the long haul. It's not easy to see how to overcome the political obstacles to the kind of reforms I want, but I feel obliged to give it a try.
Thank you. Let's all give Professor Koppel a hand.
Thank you very much.